The air in Redemption Gulch tasted of dust and fear. It was a taste Abraham Cutter knew well, but one he had not sampled in years. Twice a year he descended from the silent peaks that scraped the sky, trading solitude for salt flour and the bitter medicine of human contact. Today, that medicine was poison. The sun beat down on the cracked red earth, making the air shimmer above the sand-choked main street. The town itself was gasping for life, a collection of sun-bleached timber and false fronts huddled together against the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the territory. Abraham was halfway to the trading post, his supply list a crumpled note in his calloused hand, when the first gunshot cracked the noonday quiet. Heads ducked. Doors slammed shut. The street emptied in a heartbeat, leaving only Abraham, a stray dog, and the 5 men spilling from the bank. They moved with the lazy confidence of wolves in a chicken coop. Their leader, a man whose smile never touched his eyes, strode into the center of the street. He was dressed in black broadcloth, a stark and elegant contrast to the grime of his men. His name was Silas Blackwood, and he carried himself not like a common outlaw, but like a preacher delivering a sermon of damnation. Abraham remained still, a weathered rock in a sudden, violent river. He had no stake in this town's gold. His business was with the mountains, with the whisper of pines, and the hard, honest truths of survival. He wanted only to finish his trade and retreat to the quiet of his cabin before the first snows fell. Silas Blackwood's men were fanning out their pistols, keeping the townspeople pinned behind shuttered windows. Silas, however, was not interested in the bank's coin. He was performing. He moved with a theatrical grace, his gaze sweeping over the cowering town as if it were his congregation. His eyes, cold and sharp as obsidian chips, landed on a woman frozen with terror near the water trough. She was clutching a small whimpering child to her chest. "Fear not," Madam Silas purred his voice, a silken thread of menace. "The Lord provides for the sparrows, and he has certainly provided for us today. But earthly treasures are fleeting, things are they not?" He glided toward her, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. With a flick of his wrist, he snatched a silver locket from around her neck. The chain snapped. The woman let out a strangled cry, pulling her child tighter. Abraham's heart seized. The locket was simple, an oval of tarnished silver etched with a single climbing rose. It was identical to the one he had carved for his wife Sarah all those years ago, the one he had watched burn, turning black in the flames that had consumed his world. For a moment, the dusty street of Redemption Gulch vanished, replaced by the memory of smoke, the smell of burning pine, and a scream that had been swallowed by the roar of the fire. He did not think. He moved. His body, honed by years of solitude and unforgiving labor, covered the distance in 3 long strides. He put himself between Silas and the woman, his shadow falling over them both. He was not a tall man, but his shoulders were broad, his frame as solid and unyielding as an old-growth oak. His face, etched with the lines of wind and grief, was a mask of cold fury. "Give it back," Abraham said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like timber dragged over stone, a voice unused to speaking and unconcerned with pleasantries. Silas Blackwood stopped, his head cocked with an amused curiosity. He held the locket up, letting it twist on its broken chain in the merciless sunlight. His smile widened, a predatory slash in his handsome face. "Well now, what have we here?" A giant roused from his slumber. A mountain man by the looks of you. Come down to defend the meek. His men chuckled, their pistols still trained on the town. The woman and her child scurried away, vanishing into a nearby alley. "The locket," Abraham repeated, his voice dropping lower, colder. His hand drifted not to a weapon, but simply clenching into a fist at his side. Silas examined the piece of jewelry with feigned interest. A pretty little thing. Sentimental, I'd wager. Does it remind you of someone mountain man? A ghost, perhaps? He flicked his eyes over Abraham's worn buckskins, his wild beard, and the profound loneliness in his eyes. A flicker of something recognition, or perhaps just cold calculation, passed through his gaze. What's your name? That's no concern of yours. Ah, but it is. Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I make it my business to know the names of men with the courage to stand before me. It makes the reckoning all the more personal. He held out the locket, then just as Abraham reached for it, he closed his fist around it. But this is a toll for your interruption. He turned to his men. We're done here. The good people of Redemption Gulch have made their tithe. With a final mocking nod to Abraham, Silas, Blackwood mounted his horse. He tucked the locket into his waistcoat pocket, the silver disappearing into the black cloth like a star swallowed by the night. As his gang rode out of town, kicking up a storm of red dust, Silas's voice drifted back laced with a chilling prophecy. We'll meet again, mountain man. The Lord has a way of weaving old threads together. Abraham stood alone in the silent street, the dust settling around his boots. The locket was gone, and with it a piece of a past he had tried to bury under a mountain of silence had been violently unearthed. He had come to town for supplies, but now he knew he would be leaving with something far heavier, a purpose he did not want, and a collision with a ghost he thought he had long outrun. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the jagged peaks in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, as Abraham began his long trek back into the high country. The encounter with Silas Blackwood had left a bitter ash in his mouth. The locket was a coincidence, he told himself, a cruel trick of the light and of memory. There could be thousands like it. But his heart, a cold, hard knot in his chest, knew better. He walked past the edge of town where the last vestiges of civilization frayed into wilderness. It was there, leaning against the rail of the crumbling trading post, that he saw her. The lantern light above the door cast a weak, flickering glow, illuminating a figure so steeped in despair she seemed more shadow than substance. A woman, her face pale and gaunt, stood with one hand pressed against her swollen belly. Her clothes were little more than rags her shoes worn through. Each breath she took was a shallow, ragged thing, as if the effort of drawing it was a debt she could no longer pay. Her name was Clara Dorsey, and though her body carried the weight of two, the hollows under her eyes seemed to swallow the lantern light, speaking of a burden far heavier than the child she carried. Abraham had intended to pass by. He had his own ghosts to wrestle with. He had no room for the sorrows of another. But their eyes met, and in her gaze he saw an exhaustion that mirrored his own. It was the look of someone who had been stripped of everything but the will to take one more step. He saw the shame in the way she clutched her belly, as though shielding the unborn child from the world's judgment. He reached into his coat pocket. His fingers closed around the single folded dollar bill, the last thread of his season's work, the price of a sack of flour and a handful of cartridges. To most, it was nearly worthless. To him, it was survival. Don't waste your money on me. She wept softly, her voice trembling through the night like the cry of a cornered animal. I ain't worth the bread it could buy you. Her words cut through him sharper than any winter wind. He stopped, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. He should walk away. He had every reason to walk away. But the image of Silas Blackwood snatching another piece of a woman's dignity was still burned into his mind. To turn his back now would be to become a part of the same cruel world that had created men like Silas. He pulled the bill from his pocket and pressed it into her trembling hand. His gaze was steady, almost stern in its refusal to let her argue. He didn't see a burden nor a beggar, he saw a woman on the edge of vanishing, and a child whose life had not yet had the chance to suffer. Clara's tears darkened the bill as she tried to thrust it back at him, but his calloused fingers remained closed. "Take it," was all he said. The two words carried more weight than all the hollow promises she had ever heard. She stumbled inside the trading post, the shopkeeper's disapproving scowl following her every move. She returned, clutching a sack of flour, a small tin of beans, and a blanket worn but clean. When she stepped back outside, Abraham was still there, his broad frame leaning against the hitching rail, as if some deeper instinct warred against the decision to leave her. The sky overhead grumbled a low, ominous sound. A storm was rolling in from the hills. Abraham's eyes lifted, reading the clouds like a familiar map. He had weathered enough winters to know what it meant. Snow before morning, a killing snow for anyone caught without shelter. Clara swayed exhaustion, bending her knees, until the sack nearly tumbled from her grasp. Abraham caught at his free hand, steadying her arm. Their eyes met again, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The wind cut sharper, whistling through the skeletal frames of half-built homes, a lonely sound in a town holding its breath. "Storm's coming," he muttered. "Ain't wise to be caught out." She clutched her bundle, shame and fear tangling in her breath. "I've nowhere to go." For a moment, Abraham's silence was heavier than the storm clouds. He could walk away. He should walk away. Solitude was his sanctuary, the shield he had built around the fragile, broken thing his heart had become. To invite another soul into that space was to invite the chaos of the world back in. Yet his boots did not turn. He looked at her, at the fierce, desperate hope for the child she protected, and he saw a distorted reflection of his own past. He had failed to protect his family once. He would not fail again. He reached down, lifted the heavy sack with ease, and gestured with his head toward the dark trail leading out of town. "Then you'll follow," he said, not as a request, but as a statement of fact. Clara stared at him, relief so sharp it nearly broke her. Pride warred with survival, but the child stirred within her a silent, powerful argument. Pride would not keep them warm. Pride would not keep them alive. So she followed her faltering steps, pulling her farther from the town that had judged her and closer to the unknown fate waiting in the mountains. The road was near black, but the lanterns of Redemption Gulch shrinking behind them until only the vast starless night stretched ahead. The first flakes of snow, cold and sharp as tiny needles, drifted down, catching in Clara's hair. She trudged behind Abraham's steady pace, his silhouette a bulwark against the rising wind. She glanced at the solid strength of his back and wondered what tragedy had broken a man so profoundly that he had chosen to hide from the world, and what mercy still lived in him that he would not let her do the same. The climb was steep, the air thinning, biting at their lungs. Clara's legs ached, her breath coming in short, painful gasps, but Abraham slowed his relentless pace to match hers. The snow thickened, falling harder, faster, until the trail itself seemed to vanish beneath a blanket of white. She stumbled once, a cry of pain escaping her lips as she caught herself on his arm. He steadied her, his grip firm, his hand lingering a moment longer than necessary before he released her. At last, a faint glow appeared through the swirling storm, a single point of light in the overwhelming darkness. Abraham's cabin, half buried in pine and shadow smoke curling thin from the stone chimney. It was the promise of warmth against the gnashing cold. He pushed the door open, ushered her inside, and set the sack down by the hearth. The room was small and Spartan, furnished with only what was necessary for survival. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a bed built into the wall, and a stone fireplace that was the heart of the home. Clara collapsed onto the nearest chair as her strength gave way at last. Abraham stoked the fire, its light spreading across the room, warming the air thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke. But even within the safety of the cabin, the storm did not feel entirely shut out. Its howl pressed against the walls, rattling the shutters like an omen, a hungry beast clawing at the door. Abraham turned, watching Clara as she cradled her belly, her eyes glistening in the firelight. Something in her gaze spoke of more than hunger, more than cold. It was a fear, not yet named a danger, that still trailed her shadow like a hunter. And though Abraham had brought her in from the storm, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the blizzard outside was not the only one coming. The storm raged through the night, a symphony of howling wind and lashing snow. Inside, the fire beat back the cold with a stubborn, crackling glow. Clara sat huddled in a chair close to the flames, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. Abraham sat across from her at the rough table, a knife in his hand, slowly carving a block of pine. The steady scrape of the blade against wood was the only sound he added to the room, a rhythm as constant as his silence. Clara's exhaustion was a physical weight, yet sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of those who had turned her away, the cruel smirks, the whispers behind cupped hands. She saw the retreating back of the man who had sworn his love, and then vanished, leaving her with nothing but a child growing inside her, and a debt she could never hope to pay. His name was John Blackwood, a name that had once sounded like a promise, but now tasted like poison. Abraham glanced up from his carving, his gaze sharp and assessing. He had seen that look before in the eyes of a trapped animal, too tired to run, too afraid to rest. He set down his knife and the half-formed shape of a bird leaning back in his chair. The firelight carved deep shadows under his brow, but for the first time, the stone of his expression seemed to soften with a sliver of understanding. "You'll rest here," he said, his voice low, roughened by disuse. Clara started, pulled from her dark thoughts. I can't stay," she murmured, her fingers tightening on the worn blanket drawn across her lap. "You've done enough. I'll leave in the morning." Abraham's jaw flexed. "A storm like this don't break by morning. Roads will be buried. If you try to walk out, you won't get far before the snow takes you." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You'll stay until it passes. This ain't about what you want. It's about survival." Survival. The word hung in the air between them. She had been fighting for it every day, but here in this stranger's cabin, she felt the unfamiliar sensation of safety. The weight of it pressed tears against her lashes, but she blinked them away, unwilling to show more weakness. As the night stretched on, a new sound began to weave itself into the storm's fury, faint but certain. Hoofbeats muffled by the snow. Men's voices, low and angry, carried on a gust of wind. It was a memory at first, the echo of the danger she had fled, but as it grew louder, more distinct, the blood drained from her face. Abraham heard it too. He went utterly still, his head lifting, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The rhythmic scrape of his knife had stopped. The only sound was the fire, the wind, and the approaching threat. "What is it?" Clara whispered, her heart beginning to pound, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He didn't answer immediately. He rose, moving to the window and peering through a small crack in the shutters. Dark shapes were moving at the edge of the tree-lined, horses and men struggling against the blizzard. "Riders," he said, his voice flat and hard. "4 of them. They're not lost." Fear, cold and sharp, stabbed through Clara. "It's them," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. "They found me." She drew the blanket tighter, as if it could make her invisible. "They're debt collectors. For John." Abraham turned from the window, his face grim. He picked up his rifle from its pegs by the door. The weight of it settled in his hands with a familiar comfort. Debt collectors don't ride into a blizzard unless the debt is more than coin. He checked the chamber, the metallic click sharp and final in the tense quiet. Bar the door. Clara scrambled to her feet, her body trembling as she slid the heavy wooden bar into place. Just as it settled, a heavy fist pounded against the door, rattling the entire cabin. "We know you're in there, Dorsey," a voice roared from outside, barely audible over the wind. "And we know you ain't alone. Send her out, old man, and we'll let you live to see the dawn." Clara shrank back, a sob escaping her lips. Abraham moved to stand before the door, his frame a solid wall of defiance. "There's no one here by that name." He called out, his voice a powerful roar that seemed to shake the very logs of the cabin. "You're on private land. Move on before you get hurt." A cruel laugh answered him. "We ain't leaving without what we came for. That woman carries Blackwood property. We're here to collect." The name hit Abraham like a physical blow. Blackwood. The same name as the man in town. The man with the locket. A cold dread colder than the storm snaked its way up his spine. This was no coincidence. The threads Silas Blackwood had spoken of were being pulled tight, and he and this woman were caught in the center of the knot. Suddenly, a sharp pain lanced through Clara's side, forcing a gasp from her lips. She cried out, clutching her belly as her body folded forward. Abraham spun around, his attention torn between the threat outside and the crisis within. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice sharp with an alarm he rarely showed. Her face was pale sweat beading on her brow. "It's the baby," she whispered, her voice breaking with terror. "It's too soon. Oh, Lord, it's too soon." Another wave of pain tore through her, and she sank to the floor, her cries mingling with the howl of the wind and the angry shouts of the men outside. The door shuddered under another blow. Abraham's world narrowed to two fronts. Outside, a pack of wolves in human form. Inside, a life struggling to enter a world determined to destroy it. His heart pounded like a war drum, but his face betrayed nothing. He crouched beside Clara, his large hand surprisingly gentle on her shoulder. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice a grounding force in the chaos. "Just breathe." He rose, stoking the fire, until it roared, fetching blankets, heating water. His movements were swift, efficient. A man driven by a purpose so absolute there was no room for fear. The men outside continued their assault on the door, their shouts turning to enraged curses as the blizzard intensified. They were trapped out there, and their frustration was making them reckless. Hours blurred into an eternity of pain and fear. Clara's cries echoed through the cabin, her strength waning. Abraham worked tirelessly, his face set like granite. He murmured words of encouragement, his gruff voice a strange and steady comfort. The storm outside raged in chorus with her labor, as if the world itself was in agony. Then, as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the shutters, a new sound cut through the fury, the piercing, indignant cry of a newborn. Clara sagged back, tears of exhaustion and relief streaming down her face. Abraham held the small, squirming bundle in his hands, his rough palms cradling life as fragile as a snowflake. The baby's cries filled the cabin, a defiant roar against the storm, against the men, against death itself. He wrapped the infant in a clean blanket and placed her in Clara's trembling arms. She took her child, pressing her lips to the tiny forehead, her sobs now silent, overwhelmed by a wave of love so powerful it washed away the terror. Outside, the shouting had stopped. The pounding had ceased. The storm, having spent its fury, was beginning to quiet. Abraham moved to the window, peering out. The riders were gone. The blizzard had driven them back, at least for now. They had been denied their prize. He turned back to the scene by the fire. Mother and child bathed in the soft morning light. A fragile peace had settled over the cabin. Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. "You saved us," she whispered. Abraham shook his head, his gaze fixed on the fire. Something deep inside him, a part of his soul that had been frozen for years, had begun to thaw. "The storm saved us," he said quietly. "For now." But he knew it wasn't true. The storm had only granted them a reprieve. The name Blackwood had been spoken, and it was a name tied to the deepest wound of his own past. The men would be back. And when they returned, they would bring with them a reckoning that had been brewing for a decade. The quiet that followed the storm was heavy and fragile. Snow lay in deep, pristine drifts, smothering the world in a blanket of white so pure it felt like a lie. For 3 days, the cabin was an island of survival in a sea of silence. Abraham taught Clara how to read the language of the wilderness, the meaning of a hawk's cry, the story told by tracks in the snow. And Clara, in turn, filled the cabin's silence with the soft sounds of new life, the baby's gurgles, the gentle rhythm of her humming. A tentative peace grew between them, forged in shared crisis. Abraham watched her with the baby, a fierce tenderness in her touch that stirred a painful, buried ache in his own chest. He found himself carving a small, smooth bird for the infant, his calloused fingers working the wood with an unpracticed gentleness. He was a man who had walled himself off from the world, yet here was the world sleeping in a makeshift cradle by his fire. On the 4th day, Clara, stronger now, found the courage to speak of the shadow that haunted them. His name was John Blackwood. She began her voice low as she rocked the baby. He was a cousin to the man who leads the gang, Silas. John was charming. He promised me everything. A small plot of land just outside Redemption Gulch, a home. He said the deed was old from his family, the Blackwood claim. Abraham froze the knife in his hand, stilling. The Blackwood claim, he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yes," Clara said, oblivious to the storm gathering in his eyes. "He said he had a right to it, but Silas wanted it too. John was always in some kind of trouble owing money. When I told him about the baby, he vanished. Left me with nothing but the deed and his debts. Silas believes the land and anything on it belongs to him. He thinks I'm part of that debt." The pieces clicked into place in Abraham's mind, forming a picture so monstrous it stole the breath from his lungs. The locket, Silas Blackwood, the Blackwood claim. It was all connected, a web woven decades ago, and he was caught fast within it. He set the knife down on the table with a sharp click. The Blackwood claim, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. It wasn't John's to promise. It wasn't Silas's to claim. It was mine. Clara stared at him, her eyes wide with confusion. "Yours?" Abraham turned to face her, and the carefully constructed walls of his solitude crumbled. The grief he had carried for 10 years poured out of him raw and unvarnished. "My name is Abraham Cutter." He began, his voice thick with memory. "Years ago, I wasn't a recluse. I had a wife, Sarah, and I had a partner. His name was Jacob Blackwood." He paused, the name hanging in the air like a ghost. Jacob was Silas's older brother. We had a mining claim together, that same piece of land. We thought we'd struck silver. We were going to be rich. But the vein ran dry. We were left with nothing but dust and disappointment. Tensions grew. Jacob had a temper, and he'd been drinking. He accused me of hiding a strike from him, of cheating him. Abraham's gaze became distant, lost in a memory only he could see. We fought, right there in our main cabin. It was a stupid, pointless fight over nothing. He came at me with a pickaxe. I pushed him away. He stumbled back. He hit his head on the stone hearth. He never got up again. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was an accident. Abraham choked out the words tasting of ash. But in the chaos, a lantern was knocked over. The cabin was old dry timber. It went up in flames so fast. Sarah was trapped in the back room. I tried to get to her, but the smoke, the fire. I heard her scream once. And then, silence. Tears streamed down his face, cutting paths through the grime and stubble on his cheeks. I lost everything in that fire. My partner, my wife, my future. The law came looking. They called it the Blackwood mining tragedy. With Jacob dead and the only witness burned alive, they looked at me. Silas was just a boy then, but he was there screaming that I had murdered his brother to steal the claim. I ran. I ran up here to these mountains to bury myself where no one could ever find me. I thought if I lived in silence, I could pay my penance for the life I took, for the life I couldn't save. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a decade of unshed pain. Silas isn't hunting you for a debt, Clara. He's hunting me. He recognized my name in town, or maybe the locket was enough. Your ex-lover, John, must have tried to swindle you both with that fraudulent deed, and in doing so, he led Silas right to my doorstep. Silas is using you as bait. He doesn't want land or money. He wants revenge. He wants to take from me the one thing he thinks I could ever care about again, a family. The horrifying truth settled over the cabin. A silence deeper and more terrifying than any storm. They were not two strangers thrown together by chance. They were two victims of the same tragedy, their fates intertwined by a fire that had never truly gone out. Clara looked from Abraham's anguished face to the sleeping child in her arms. This baby wasn't just her daughter. She was now the focal point of a decade-old blood feud. The peace they had found was a lie. The cabin was not a sanctuary. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. "What will we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Abraham wiped the tears from his face with the back of his hand. The grief in his eyes slowly hardened into something else, something cold and resolute. The haunted look was gone, replaced by the grim determination of a man who had lost everything once and would rather die than lose it again. "He wants a reckoning." Abraham said, his voice a low growl. "He wants to finish the story that started in that fire. Then that's what we'll give him. But it won't end in this cabin. It will end on my terms." He rose and went to a loose floorboard beneath his bed. He pulled it up, revealing a hidden compartment. From it, he drew a heavy pistol and a box of cartridges, items he hadn't touched in years. "There's an old abandoned church on the outskirts of Redemption Gulch," he said, his movements deliberate and purposeful. "It stands on a bluff overlooking the plains, a place of judgment. That's where we'll meet him. We leave at dusk." He looked at Clara, his gaze locking with hers. He thinks he's the storm, but he has no idea what kind of tempest he has awakened. The journey to the church was a descent into a waking nightmare. They moved under the cloak of a bruised twilight, the snow crunching underfoot with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the still air. Abraham carried the baby swaddled tightly and tucked inside his coat, while Clara followed close behind, his rifle in her hands. He had shown her how to load and fire it, her hands clumsy, but her eyes filled with a desperate resolve. She was no longer just a victim. She was a mother protecting her child. As they cleared the tree line, the wind began to pick up, carrying not snow, but sand. A dust storm was brewing on the plains, a churning wall of brown that was swallowing the horizon. It was a fitting omen. The church stood silhouetted against the roiling sky, a skeletal frame with a broken steeple, its windows like hollow eye sockets. It was a place of forgotten prayers and final reckonings. They slipped inside just as the first grains of sand began to whip through the air. The interior was cavernous and cold, filled with the ghosts of sermons and the groans of dying wood. "He'll come," Abraham said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "He's been tracking us since we left the cabin." They did not have to wait long. Through the howl of the rising sandstorm, they heard the approach of horses. Figures on horseback materialized out of the brown haze circling the church like vultures. One figure dismounted and strode toward the splintered doors. Silas Blackwood. He pushed the doors open and stepped inside, the wind swirling around him, making his black coat billow like the wings of a fallen angel. Two of his men followed, their faces grim. Abraham Cutter's Silas said, his voice cutting through the wind's shriek. His eyes burning with a cold fire found Abraham standing before the ruined altar. "I knew you'd come out of your hole eventually. Guilt is a powerful motivator." "This has nothing to do with guilt," Silas, Abraham said, his voice steady. "This is about you and the lies you fed your hatred for 10 years. Silas laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Lies, I saw the fire, Cutter. I heard my brother's name on your lips as you fled. You murdered him for that claim and burned your own wife to cover your tracks." He gestured toward Clara, who stood half hidden behind a pillar, the rifle trembling in her hands. "And now you found another woman to hide behind. Another family to destroy." "It was an accident, Silas. Jacob fell." "So you say," Silas sneered. "But we'll never know the truth, will we? It burned with them." He took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "My cousin John was a fool. He thought he could play us both. I found him weeks ago. He told me everything before he died, including where he left this little stray." He smiled his venomous smile at Clara. "You were never the prize, just the bait, a way to draw the monster from his cave." The wind howled, rattling the church's bell in the broken steeple. It began to toll a single, erratic, discordant note, a death knell. "So here we are," Silas said, his voice dropping, "at the altar of judgment. I'm going to offer you a choice, Cutter. The kind of choice you never gave my brother. Give me the woman and the child. I'll let you walk out of here. You can return to your mountain life, out your miserable days alone with your ghosts. It's a merciful end." He drew his pistol. "Or you can fight for them, and I will burn your world down all over again, right here in God's forgotten house." Abraham looked at Clara, at the terror in her eyes, and then at the sleeping bundle in his arms. He had run from his past once. He would not run again. "This isn't about your brother anymore," Abraham said, shifting the baby carefully to one arm and drawing his own pistol. "This is about a man who hunts women and children to settle his scores. The only judgment happening here today, Silas, is yours." He fired. The church exploded into a maelstrom of sound and fury. Gunshots echoed like thunder, mingling with the shriek of the wind and the clang of the bell. Sand poured through the broken windows, blinding them. Silas's men charged forward. Abraham met them, his pistol barking his body a shield for Clara and the child. He shot one man through the chest. The other tackled him, and they crashed to the floor, wrestling for control of the gun. Clara, seeing her chance, screamed and fired the rifle. The shot went wide, but it splintered the pillar next to Silas's head, making him flinch. It was the opening Abraham needed. He slammed his attacker's head against the stone floor and scrambled to his feet. He and Silas faced each other across the sand-swept nave. The ticking clock of the church bell grew more frantic. "You will not take them," Abraham roared over the storm. "They are already lost," Silas screamed back, firing his pistol. Abraham felt a searing pain in his side, but he stayed on his feet. He fired back his shot, hitting Silas in the shoulder, spinning him around. Silas cried out in rage and pain, dropping his gun. He lunged for it, but Abraham was faster. He kicked the pistol away, and it skittered into the darkness. Silas, clutching his shoulder, stared at Abraham with eyes full of pure, unadulterated hatred. "This changes nothing," he hissed. "I will hunt you to the end of your days." Abraham leveled his pistol at Silas's head. His finger tightened on the trigger. He could end it. Right here. End the hate, the fear, the ghost that had haunted him for a decade. He saw Sarah's face in his mind, heard her scream. But then he looked at the baby in his arm, felt its warm, living weight. Killing Silas in cold blood wouldn't bring Sarah back. It would only make him the monster Silas already believed him to be. He lowered the gun. "No," he said, his voice ragged. "It's over." At that moment, the church groaned, a final, terrible sound. The wind, in a furious gust, tore the great bell from its moorings. It crashed down through the rotten roof, bringing timber and stone down with it. Abraham threw himself and the baby behind the stone altar just as the ceiling collapsed, burying the spot where Silas Blackwood had stood. The storm, as if its work was done, began to subside. Silence fell, broken only by the baby's startled cries. Abraham, wounded and bleeding, pushed himself up. Where Silas had been, there was only a mountain of rubble. He had won. He had faced his past and chosen life over vengeance. He limped over to where Silas's pistol had fallen and saw something glinting in the dust beside it. The silver locket. He picked it up, its cool metal, a solid, tangible link to all that he had lost and all that he had just fought to protect. He pocketed it and went to Clara, who was weeping with relief. "It's over," he set, his hand on her shoulder. "It's truly over." The sandstorm gave way to a bruised dawn. Wounded but alive, Abraham led Clara and the baby out of the ruined church and back toward the waking town of Redemption Gulch. He did not turn toward the mountains. His time in hiding was over. He walked straight to the sheriff's office, the infant cradled in one arm, Clara leaning on the other. Sheriff Thompson, a world-weary man with tired eyes, looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from surprise to alarm at their battered state. There, in the quiet of the small office, Abraham told him everything. He spoke of Jacob Blackwood's accidental death, the fire, and the 10 years of guilt that had driven him into exile. He told of Silas's campaign of revenge, which had culminated in the battle at the church. Clara corroborated his story, her voice gaining strength with every word. When he was done, Abraham placed his pistol and the recovered locket on the sheriff's desk. "I'm not running anymore," he said. Sheriff Thompson listened, his gaze shifting between Abraham's honest, weary face and the evidence on his desk. He picked up the locket, turning it over in his hands. He had been the deputy who investigated the Blackwood tragedy all those years ago. He remembered the inconsistencies and the lingering sense that the official story of murder and greed was too simple. Silas Blackwood spread a lot of poison in this territory, the sheriff said slowly. He looked at the report of the bank robbery at Silas's known associates, some of whom now lay dead at the church. "His body is under that rubble, you say?" Abraham nodded. The sheriff sighed, a sound that carried the weight of years. He pushed a piece of paper across the desk. "As far as I'm concerned, Silas Blackwood and his gang were killed resisting arrest for the bank robbery." "The old Blackwood case?" He looked Abraham square in the eye. "It was a tragedy. It's closed. It's..." The weight of a decade lifted from Abraham's shoulders. He was a free man, not just from the law, but from the prison of his own past. A week later, Abraham stood before the town registrar, Clara at his side. The official, a small man with ink-stained fingers, looked at them over his spectacles. "And the child's name?" he asked. Clara looked at Abraham, her eyes full of a love and gratitude that was as deep and quiet as the mountains he called home. He gave a slight nod. "Hope," Clara said, her voice clear and firm. "Her name is Hope Cutter." The registrar wrote it down, the scratching of his pen sealing their new beginning. They were a family, not by blood, but by a bond forged in storm's fire and unwavering devotion. For the final act of closure, Abraham took them to the small, wind-swept cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. He stopped before a simple wooden cross, weathered by 10 years of sun and snow. The name carved into it was faint, but still legible: Sarah Cutter. He stood for a long moment at the silence filled only by the wind, whistling through the dry grass. He took the silver locket from his pocket. Its surface was scratched from the fight, but the climbing rose was still visible. He looked from the grave to the new life, Hope, sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms. With a final steady breath, he knelt and placed the locket on the earth at the base of the headstone, a final tribute to the love that had defined his past. He had closed that chapter. His grief for Sarah would always be a part of him, but it would no longer be his only story. He rose, turning his back on the grave, and walked toward Clara and the child. He wrapped his arm around them, pulling them close as they stood together, looking out not at the setting sun behind them, but at the new dawn rising in the east. Their future was an open trail, and for the first time in a very long time, Abraham Cutter was not afraid to walk it.